There was simply throughout the law enforcement community never information that would put this individual on a no-fly list or a selectee list. So that's number one. Number two, I think the important thing to recognize here is that once this incident occurred, everything happened that should have.
How does a person on the terrorism watch list get a U.S. visa? I mean, particularly when you consider that his father was concerned about his son's proclivities this fall. I think there's much to investigate here.
Much to investigate, and just today we learned there will be an investigation. Independent Joe Lieberman and Republican Susan Collins say they are going to hold hearings in the new year, finding out what happened with the Christmas Day terrorist.
It's
not over.
It's not a national security issue, it's also a political issue, and we're talking about it next on Top Line.
Welcome to ABC News Top Line. I'm John Cochran.
Yeah, and I'm David Curley. We thank you for joining us.
And today we're going to look at many topics. Among them, we're going to look at...
Let me start, John.
The latest, yes.
With my little top line.
All right.
Which is the low-profile president. President Obama has not said anything publicly about this terrorist attack that happened on Christmas Day. We do expect him to do something a little bit later today, but he's been on Christmas vacation in Hawaii, and so far nothing, just statements. And John, this has been a calculated effort by the White House. They didn't want the president out too soon. He's ordered some investigations. Today we're going to hear quite a bit more from him, but it's been very quiet from Hawaii so far.
Very quiet, and some people will say it's a day late and a dollar short. We'll see what the president says later. But also, this was the year that was. We'd have to find out who really made the big political mistakes in 2009? Was it President Obama when he just sort of went into the weeds last summer and didn't defend himself when the Republicans beat him up over health care reform? Or was it the Republicans who almost willingly have let themselves be painted as the party of no?
You actually think this is a period of vacation for the Republicans to think about what do they want to do in the new year?
And they've got to talk to people back home. Was it smart? People are angry. But did they really want no action, or did they want some different kind of action? You know, the Republicans are taking a chance here, too.
Oh, talking about back and forth, let the bargaining begin. All the senators and House members are home for vacation, but their staff members are starting to return to Washington and bargaining over what will be the final health care reform bill, what will be in and what will be out. I got a feeling that we're not going to see a public option, John, when this finally gets solved.
All right. Another question. Republicans on the rise. A year from now, when we're sitting here wondering who are going to be the top Republican presidential candidates in the year 2012. It's too early maybe to talk about it now, but it won't be a year from now in 2010. Who will those names be? Right now, who would you guess? Give me three.
Oh, that's a difficult one. The question is, will Palin be in or not? Pawlenty is one we've heard. I mean, that's a name that's been battered around. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's a name we haven't heard of before. I mean, look at how Obama kind of came out of, I mean, there had been some discussion about him when he actually spoke to the Democratic Convention and leading up to the next presidential election. But there may be a name out of nowhere.
Right. And of course, George Romney has lots of money. And he's always out there. He's omnipresent. Well, we're going to talk to some people who actually know what they're talking about on this subject, from the Republican side and from the Democratic side. From the Republican side, we've got strategist Phil Musser, and from the Democratic side, Chris Kofinis. Well, let me ask first from the Republican side, going back to this terrorist incident on Christmas Day. Do Republicans have to be careful about this? When you get into national security issues, you can overplay your cards when you start playing politics. The Republicans have been critical, but they haven't kind of gone over that line there. And there is a line, isn't there?
I think there is a line, John, at the end of the day, and I'd be surprised to see this become a real political, partisan matter. I think Leader McConnell in the intro here was raising legitimate points about understanding the process by which a terrorist got on this plane in the first place, and that's certainly a legitimate point. I think you're right, though. America doesn't look for investigations of this nature to become overly partisan. Certainly with Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins, not flamethrowers from a partisan perspective, either of them. I would expect that any investigation of the Congress is focused on the facts and focused on ways to improve this for the future. If you see any political hay being made out of this, it'll probably revolve around, Secretary Napolitano's statements that the process worked, quote unquote, clearly didn't. And then secondarily, if the TSA implements a lot of new and strange and onerous requirements on travelers. I think that'll really get to Americans' pulse pretty quickly. So I'd watch those two things, but no real politics in the sense of Republican versus Democrat.
We should add that Napolitano has now changed her stand a little bit and is saying that it did fail, the system did fail, and that's quite obvious that something did go wrong. Chris, hasn't this been a little bit politicized already, though? Ben Smith points out in Politico that Republicans are holding up a TSA chief, that there's questions about funding that the Republicans, I mean, politics is involved in everything we talk about, isn't it?
This is a political business, and it doesn't matter what happens, there's always going to be politics involved. Listen, I think Phil's right. This is a dangerous one. When you're talking about national security, if you try to play too much of the partisan card, there tends to be a backlash. So I think the Republicans need to be kind of careful here. I think it's right to ask questions. It's right to say, okay, where did the system work? Where didn't it work? Where do we need to improve? I think those are all appropriate. I think the White House has been smart in not sending out the president too early when you don't know all the facts. That sometimes can be a political mistake. I think it's right to wait and see, okay, what do we know about this individual, about where the process worked again, and where it didn't work. And so I think that has been a smart tact from the White House. But at the end of the day, playing politics with national security tends to be a very dangerous political football.
So it's kind of a reminder of right after 9/11. President Bush got a lot of support from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, because this is, you know, when you're talking about a threat to national security, it really isn't partisan. You know, the terrorist on the plane didn't care if the Republicans or Democrats on the plane. He was trying to kill Americans. And I think most people understand that, and I think that's where the focus needs to stay.
It may be a bipartisan issue in that sense, but national security has always been a bad issue for Democrats. It goes back to the Cold War. Soft on communism, the Republicans said of the Democrats, going back to Harry Truman. It's more, it's a third rail really for the Democrats more than it was for George Bush, wasn't it?
Right. Well, I think there's a philosophical divide too. It depends a lot on how, frankly, they treat this terrorist suspect. I mean, there's an argument, and a legitimate legal argument about whether he should be treated as a war criminal or he should be treated within the criminal, prosecution in the U.S. Attorney's Office out in central Michigan. So I think there are issues of how you handle this, and I think that the Bush administration, you can fault them for a variety of things, but on national security issues, clearly they did a good job of keeping the country safe for the post 9/11 period. I think that inherently the country will be more skeptical of President Obama. Frankly, he's silent on this. I'm not sure necessarily he should have weighed in, so I'm not second-guessing the White House's perspective on that. But the sense and the perception that Democrats have a different approach to prosecuting the war on terror than Republicans, ultimately, if there is an incident, can lead to a variety of different ways that the party is perceived politically.
Well, we have had our incident, Chris. I mean,
right.
This is where he's going to prove himself. Partly on national security. I mean, he's taken a big step in Afghanistan, so you can argue that he's a war president now. He owns that war. How this administration handles this says a lot about our national security, doesn't it?
I think how they handle national security, period, says a lot about every president. And I think contrary to, the normal way or the traditional way of looking at this divide between Republicans somehow strong in national security and Democrats not as much, I don't think that applies anymore. I think the Bush administration proved the exact opposite. That talking big does not necessarily mean you're effective, and you saw that I think with the failed policy both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, as well as the reality that terrorism during the Bush administration actually increased. It didn't happen in the United States, but the number of terrorist incidents was greater by the end of his term than the beginning. So in terms of President Obama, I think dealing with this issue clearly has enormous sensitivities, but it does for every president. And I think what you've seen both in terms of Afghanistan, as well as in terms of the drone attacks in parts of Pakistan, is a president who is willing to use force when necessary. And I don't think anyone's going to question his determination to keep this country safe.
Yeah, but let me pick up on just something to kind of on that. I think Americans, and John, you covered a lot of these presidents, they want to see presidential leadership on national security, and so they want to hear from their president at critical moments, at critical times. And Americans are willing to follow that based on that leadership. And so, I agree with ultimately the president's decision with respect to more troops into Pakistan. He's clearly, left a lot on his plate and working hard on this agenda, but he hasn't been overly forceful with respect to articulation of his views on that matter, and it took a long time, and there was a lot of process involved with it. And now we have kind of silence on this. Americans want to hear from their presidents on key national security issues.
I don't agree with that at all.
Stay tuned, because
agree with that
you're going to hear from them in just a couple of hours.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us.